right, I'd like to welcome you all to the Dizzle seminar series. I am not your regularly scheduled MC, so I'll try not to mess anything up too badly. I am happy to introduce PhD student Manuel Coffill-Rivera, who will be presenting his research prospectus talk. This seems really loud. Is it really loud? No, it's good. Okay. Manuel received his Bachelor of Science in Marine Science from Florida Gulf Coast University in 2017, where his senior research project examined the effects of nutrients and grazers on turtle grass. He then received a master's in science in wildlife, fisheries, and aquaculture from Mississippi State in 2022, where he worked on the effects of temperature on growth, metabolic rates, and tolerance of low oxygen conditions in speckled peacock bass. Manuel also did a stint with Florida Fish and Wildlife Research Institute, where he worked on fishery independent monitoring projects, which was a good preparation for some of the stuff he's been doing here. As of 2024, Manuel has at least 4 first author peer-reviewed publications. He's been the recipient of the Stokes School of Marine and Environmental Sciences Fellowship, research funding via the Joe Bullard Senior Fisheries Research Fund, and the Best Student Paper Award at the annual meeting of the Mississippi chapter of the American Fisheries Society. Manuel is now pursuing his PhD here at University of South Alabama and the Dauphin Island Sea Lab in Dr. Sean Powers' Fisheries Ecology Lab, where he's focused on research topics relevant to improving management advice for fishery species in the northern Gulf of Mexico. And I just want to, real quick before I turn it over to Manuel, I want to point out that Manuel's research, at least in part, is taking on one of the most difficult and most perennial problems in fisheries science, understanding the factors that affect the relationship between spawning stock biomass and recruitment. This relationship is really foundational to modern stock assessment models, and understanding how that relationship is affected by environmental change is a critical step towards comprehensive ecosystem-based fisheries science and fisheries management. So Manuel's really taking on the holy grail a little bit here, or at least a little chunk of it, which I really appreciate, and I'm proud of him for doing that. So with no further ado, I'll turn it over to Manuel.
Thank you so much, Mark. Can y'all hear me okay? Am I good spot? Okay. So thank you so much for being here. Good afternoon. My name is Manuel, PhD student in Dr. Powers' lab. I am really excited to share a little bit of my dissertation proposal or prospectus with you. But of course, I'd like to start off with acknowledging some folks. First, my graduate committees, Dr. Powers, Stephen Cyphers, Mark here, Dr. Jason Cope, and Marcus Dryman. And then I like to acknowledge a lot of the folks that really had no reason to help me along the way, but have been instrumental in helping me get through this, at least to this point. And that includes folks like Dr. Batchelor, Heather Moncrief-Koss, Kate Oberly, Kelsey Martin from the Southeast Fisheries Science Center, as well as Jessica Carroll and Kristen Cook from Florida Fish and Wildlife, John Maresca from Alabama Marine Resources Department. And then I'd like to thank the Fisheries Ecology Lab. I have some representation here. Thank you for being here. The Marine Fisheries Ecology Lab, Dr. Dryman's lab, and then of course the Mobile JCs for allowing me to sample fish during the deep sea fishing rodeo, as well as the captains that have been very involved with sample collection for this project. So I'd like to take a moment to thank you all. All right, let's talk about fisheries, as you probably all know here. So it's a very significant social-cultural, holds a very significant social-cultural value worldwide across many countries, where it provides food and economic security. In 2020, it was estimated that over 90 million tons came from global capture fisheries. And in the US in 2022, US fisheries contributed to over $300 billion and supported over 2 billion jobs. So trying to drive the point here, of course, that it's a very important activity, not just in the US, but across the world. And then something that may seem trivial is the recreational activity for fisheries. So historically, we were mainly concerned about commercial fisheries, but over the past couple of decades, fishing for recreational activities or recreational purposes has really taken off. So that's something that we need to consider and account for when we're trying to manage fisheries. And of course, like many other ecological realms, fisheries are directly and indirectly affected by climate change and other anthropogenic activities. And now let's focus more on marine fisheries in the US. Marine fisheries in the US are governed by the Magnuson-Stevens Act, which was passed in 1976, and it's had multiple reauthorizations ever since, but mainly we refer to MSA as the eternal law over marine fisheries in the US. And among many objectives of the MSA Act are to avoid overfishing and rebuild overfished stocks. And when this act was passed, it created regional fishery management councils that essentially are responsible for managing fisheries in their region. So if you look at the map that I'm presenting in the bottom, you can see some of the different fishery management councils across the country. We have multiple down here in this, or yeah, multiple in the Southeast, including the Gulf of Mexico, South Atlantic, and the Caribbean. And within the jurisdiction of the states are in charge of their marine fisheries. So things like the inshore species that are very common in our region, like red drum, spotted sea trout, those are managed by the states, and usually there is some type of fishery management plan in place that all states try to follow, but for the most part, the states are in charge of those inshore fisheries. But when it comes to federal waters, that's where it's mainly federally managed. And when applicable, there will be collaboration between different agencies, different institutions, different countries. So for example, think of tunas or any other highly migratory species that comes into U.S. waters and then may move to another jurisdiction. In those cases, it's really essential to have some type of international fishery management in place. So now, how do we assess fish stocks and provide management advice? Very, very complex process. I think that's my point here with this slide. It requires a lot of data, a lot of different entities to be involved, but mainly when we're assessing fish stocks, we rely on quantitative assessments to do so. And these assessments, as you can see on the slide, require a ton of information, at least in a data-rich scenario. So to orient you, let's start in the top left there. Our data, we need data. Mainly, we need catch data. That's essentially the first thing that we need. Without catch data, we really can't, assess the status of a stock. But besides the catch data, we need things like abundance indices, biological composition. So what does the catch look like? What lengths make up the catch? What ages make up the catch? And then we also need a lot of life history information, which you see in the bottom left and under the parameters. So things like mortality, age and growth, reproduction, selectivity, all that comes together in these very fancy statistical models. And essentially they help us ask questions like, what is the status of the stock? What's the scale of the stock? So how big is the stock? And the status relative to a virgin condition of the stock. So how does the stock look compared to if there was no fishing in place? And then we can also get into questions about the productivity of the stock. So how productive is the stock? How much fishing pressure can it support before it's overfished or experiencing overfishing? So all those things come together, and essentially that informs control rules, which tell the managers essentially say, okay, like we can harvest this much, and then other management measures that go into place, like things like stock or minimum size limits, slot limits, all that comes together, and then essentially they can control the output of the fishery, so the catch and the input as well, and that would be the effort. So those are two things that managers can control about a fishery: is how much fishermen or fishers can take out of a stock, so the catch, and how much effort they can put into the stock. And essentially, we want to do this routinely, depending on how vulnerable the stock is. We might do this every several years to make sure that we have updated catch advice and hopefully avoid overfishing stocks. And I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the concerns with managing fisheries worldwide, mainly, before I get into my dissertation chapters. So historically, we conduct, or fishery scientists conduct assessments using a single species approach. So doing these, you would essentially go, if going back to that slide that I just showed you, all that information comes directly from the stock. So the catch, the biological information, the life history, all that comes together, right? But during when we're trying to give management advice, we don't really consider ecosystem impacts explicitly that much, at least historically. So that's something that we need to improve as fishery scientists and fisheries managers. So there is a growing interest to progress towards ecosystem-based fisheries management where we account for these things. We account for things like climate change, because there's a lot of evidence that these processes are directly affecting our fish stocks, especially things like the productivity of fish stocks. And one of the proposed approaches that has been put forward is just thinking about or considering environmental covariates within the stock assessment. And, we can think of trying to include an environmental variable that we hypothesize affects the fish stock or trophic interactions. And here I provide you with two examples from our region. So in the bottom left, you have red grouper. And there's a lot of evidence that red grouper has been affected by red tide blooms in Florida. So, there is some information regarding the mortality of red grouper coming directly from the red tide events directly in the assessment. So the assessment for red grouper has some level of environmental consideration before it gives out management advice. And then another one here is the Atlantic menhaden. And when the menhaden is assessed, it's obvious, maybe if nobody knows here, it's a very important forage fish across the Atlantic and the Gulf. So when they're assessing the menhaden, the assessors consider its important role in the diet of major predators, mainly striped bass. So when managers are trying to give some catch advice, they consider that, okay, menhaden not just only supports commercial catch, it also plays a very important role in the ecosystem as a very important forage species. So when we give catch advice, we need to consider that it needs to fulfill that role for the menhaden specific, or for the striped bass specifically. And then a few more, like I mentioned earlier, there's evidence of non-stationarity and productivity. And when I say that, I mean that there's changes to the life history of species, mainly due to environmental drivers that climate change is pushing. So think about recruitment, things like recruitment or size at age or growth. All of these can be affected by environmental covariates. And I have one notorious example here from the Atlantic. So I have the lobster here on the bottom left. And for about 2 decades, the American lobster has been experiencing recruitment failure, where there's not enough lobsters recruiting into the fishery. And that's a very important thing. It's a very historically important fishery. And of course, without that replenishment of the population, you run into some issues from a management perspective. And of course, this drives, changes to fisheries. And something I skipped there is, the changes in climate have also generated range shifts or range expansions. And here I show you another notorious example from the east coast of the US, black sea bass, historically distributed all along the South Atlantic, or mainly in the southern part of the US South Atlantic. And over time, the southern portion of the stock has been really depleted, no recruitment coming back into the fishery. And there's also at the same time evidence that the stock is expanding further north into those grounds where the American lobster is. And of course, that brings some issues like stakeholders thinking that black sea bass is responsible for the failed recruitment of the lobster, but that might not necessarily be the case. But it will seem that way to stakeholders. And like I mentioned, all this is driving a lot of changes in fisheries. And I have another species here. So the Jonah crab, historically, the Jonah crab was a bycatch species in the lobster fishery. And now that the lobster fishery has, reduced significantly in catch, now Jonah crab is a desired species. So, we're noticing all these changes. And of course, we need to account for all these changes if we want to, have climate resilient fisheries management as climate continues to change across time. And a few more concerns here. Just to touch a little bit on, obviously, the anthropogenic effects, right? So we have things like habitat degradation, losing things like essential fish habitat, like seagrass, for example, or oysters. And then we also have eutrophication. But one of the main anthropogenic effects that I wanted to highlight here is fisheries-induced evolution. So from selective harvest across many fish generations, like getting the fastest growing fish or the largest fish, over time we lose those fast growing phenotypes. And essentially we end up with stocks that don't grow as much as they used to, and we can see that that's been highlighted in cod, for example. It's a stock that's been subject to fishing pressure for hundreds of years. So we have a somewhat rich history of catch and changes to the stock, and we can see that reflected in the cod stock or in the cod stocks. And then to get a little bit more into our region here, so if I'm sure most of y'all know, but we have very important reef fisheries in the Gulf and South Atlantic, composed of many different species with different life histories, different vulnerabilities to fishing pressure. And of course, with the increasing recreational effort that I mentioned before, we're getting a lot more fishing pressure on these stocks. And since it's hard to select which one specific species, you constantly run into bycatch of perhaps species that are out of season, for example. And with reef fisheries occurring at very, fairly deep or fairly deep depths, excuse me, there, we run into issues with discarding, causing mortality, or what we call dead discards, because of barotrauma, or the fish not being able to go back to the depth that they came from. And of course, that leads to, it becomes a major source of mortality on the fish stocks. And we need to account for that mortality when we're assessing the fish stocks. So essentially, all these fish are being killed but not harvested, which leads to reduced harvest opportunities for our stakeholders. And of course, that comes with reduced stakeholder satisfaction. So the reef fisheries, very, very hard to manage, just incredibly difficult to manage. There's a lot of components that you have to consider, a lot of different stakeholder groups that you have to account for. And one more issue that's kind of related to that is the drastically changing sector allocations for those reef fisheries. So historically, like I mentioned, a lot of these fish stocks were mainly subject to commercial fishing pressure. But as the recreational effort has increased over time, managers have changed the allocation of these stocks to favor the recreational sector more, since it's bigger. And that runs into some issues with stakeholder satisfaction, as well as, like I mentioned in the previous point, that very high discard mortality that comes from the recreational sector. And I show here the famous red snapper from specifically in the South Atlantic. This is the main issue that leads the stock to continue being overfished and experiencing overfishing. It's those high rates of discard mortality. All right, let's get into it now. So our main objectives here for me are investigate the ways and effects of considering environmental covariates in single species stock assessment, provide life history information for a poorly described segment of a federally managed fish stocks distribution, and then for that same fish stock, describe habitat associations over a poorly described segment of its distribution. All this with the major goal of supporting climate resilient fisheries management. And to answer that first goal, we'll be looking at environment recruitment relationships on spotted sea trout. First, let me introduce you to recruitment. As Mark mentioned, a very important component of population dynamics. It's what drives the replenishment of our populations, strongly influences the stock productivity and resilience to exploitation, like I previously mentioned. And of course, it's influenced by many, many, many different factors. And that includes spawning stock biomass, processes that are happening during the larval stage, as well as the post-settlement stage. And you can see in the bottom right, or upper right, I'm sorry, a very generalized diagram of population dynamics. So you have births or recruitment, you have immigration, all feeding into a fish population. And then we have the deaths coming out. And in terms of fisheries, that would be both natural mortality and fishing mortality. And then you have some emigration in there as well. And traditionally, to estimate recruitment from a fisheries point of view, we rely on what we call these stock recruit relationships, which essentially is some level of relationship between your spawning biomass and your recruitment. And the problem with that being that, these curves or these models can be somewhat uncertain, if not highly uncertain. And part of that is really influenced by this steepness parameter, which we don't really have to get into, but it's a major parameter within a stock recruit relationship that essentially tells you how productive a fish stock is. Okay, and recently, there's a lot of evidence that, these stock recruit relationships don't hold for a lot of fish stocks. And some different authors have shown that environmental covariates may be better predictors of recruitment rather than spawn and stock biomass. And some of this recent work also highlights the use of environmental covariates to predict poor recruitment. So when we have very extreme environmental covariates, think of things like heat waves or very, very warm temperatures, you can predict poor recruitment. And this work really tries to highlight that maybe it's not worth our time to predict recruitment during good conditions. Rather, it's more feasible to predict poor recruitment when we see these environmental extremes. And this was recently highlighted in our region with oyster by a former postdoc in our lab, Jeff Plumley. And he found some correlation between these extreme warming events with poor recruitment for eastern oyster. And then I also show the cod here again. Cod has a lot of information. So this was also shown for cod recently, where about 20 years ago, they were trying to establish environment recruitment relationships for cod, and it wasn't as fruitful. And now these relationships were revisited with all these additional years of data. And this poor recruitment paradigm that I'm talking about was established for the cod stock. All this to really show you that there is some benefit to looking at environment recruitment relationships. So again, I'm showing you this very busy graph here because there's something else that recruitment really influences, that being reference points. What are these reference points? They're the levels that, they tell us, they determine stock status for us. So they tell us whether we are fishing too much, if the stock is too low, too high, or we can fish more. So they're basically the division that tells us, okay, where the stock is okay or the stock is not okay. And I know there's a lot happening here, but just to orient you, on the upper left diagram there, we have what we call a Kobe plot. And across the x-axis, we have stock size. And across the y, we have fishing mortality. And you don't really need to remember the acronyms, but essentially those lines there are where we divide whether the stock is in good condition or not. So for the stock size, if we're to the right of the MSST line, it means that the stock is not overfished. And then for the fishing mortality, a y-axis, if you're below the MFMT line, it means that you're not overfishing. Your fishing mortality level is okay. But if you're over that, then you're overfishing or putting too much fishing mortality on the fish stock. And just to show an example of this to you, if we move to the lower diagram there, we have two panels. We have stock size on the top, and then we have fishing mortality below. And we can see how a fish stock changes over different exploitation levels across the stock. So if we start from the left, moving to the right, we have an unexploited fish stock, and you can see that the stock size is very high there. And then, of course, that corresponds with non-existent fishing mortality. But as we increase the fishing mortality and we see that the fish stock goes down, we continue increasing that fishing mortality, and then we're getting to those reference points that, again, you don't need to remember the acronyms, but essentially those lines are our reference points. As we increase fishing mortality, the fish stock goes down. It's getting to the reference points there at the fully exploited, so like that third panel. And then we're increasing fishing mortality, and now our fish stock is under the reference levels that we established. So now the stock is overfished. And this is where management would try to intervene and perhaps reduce fishing mortality to eventually build that stock back up to be around those reference points. So I know that's a lot happening there, but that's just to kind of generalize there how this all works. So it's very important to have good reference points or accurate reference points, because that's what's telling you, that's how you decide okay, the stock is okay or the stock is not okay. And traditionally, these are derived using those stock recruit relationships that I mentioned earlier. And like I said, they can be somewhat uncertain. And one of the major assumptions with these stock recruit relationships is that they're time invariant in terms of productivity. So we're assuming that the production of a stock doesn't change across time, which tends to not be the case sometimes. So it's something that we need to think about when we're trying to establish these reference points, because otherwise you might be making some biased management decisions. So what to do about these reference points? Like I just mentioned, we can estimate them from the stock recruit relationship, but we need a data-rich scenario to even attempt to do this. We need different levels of stock size. We need a somewhat rich history of the stock to even attempt to do this, or to allow the assessment to do this for us. Another alternative that may be more applicable to many fish stocks is using maximum sustainable yield proxy. So things like spawning potential ratio, which you're mainly tracking the amount of spawning biomass in a population. So some of the main ones that are used are like 30% or 40% of a unfished fish stock. And we try not to go below that, just stay somewhere around that relative stock size. And then we can also try to account for that time variant productivity that I mentioned. This is something a little more novel. And again, it's very data intensive. So in these approaches, these approaches allow you to account for that productivity changing over time on a year-to-year basis. So if we look at this graph here in the upper panel, we're trying to include environmental interactions as well as trophic processes with the spawning biomass of a stock and the recruitment to have this dynamic productivity, which you see in the bottom center there, where across time that productivity is changing, we're accounting for it. And that will allow us to provide better reference points than a perhaps stationary approach, which you're assuming that a stock is not changing productivity across time, and you're just going off of that assumption to provide those reference points and management advice. Okay, so the objectives for this chapter are to conduct an integrated assessment of spotted sea trout and investigate environment recruitment relationships for this stock in Alabama, and then evaluate methods of considering these identified relationships within a stock assessment. And why spotted sea trout, you may ask yourself. Most of you may know this. This might be obvious, but it's one of the most targeted, most harvested inshore species in the Southeast U.S. It's state managed, and the stock in Alabama hasn't been assessed since 2018. And when this assessment was done, it was found that the stock was overfished and experiencing overfishing. And again, I have a Kobe plot here, like the one we saw earlier in the bottom right. So in the x-axis, we have relative fishing mortality, and then on the y, we have that spawn and stock biomass. And if we follow that from the red dot, or I'm sorry, from the blue-green dots, those are the earlier assessment years and then the red is the most recent the most recent years that were assessed. And you can see how across time, that fishing mortality is increasing, that biomass is, decreasing as well. And eventually, those last few years, we've been overfishing and the stock has been below the target biomass level. So that led the state to, implement some management measures. The spotted sea trout stock moved to a slot limit with the allowance of a overslot fish, and that was implemented in 2019. And it's been about 5-6 years now, so it's about time to really look at the health of the stock, see where it's at, and provide updated management advice to see where we are. But as well, there's some evidence from other estuaries across the Southeast that there are some environmental covariates that really affect the recruitment of spotted sea trout. And at the same time, recreational fishing has taken some awareness to catch and release, and especially of the larger fish. So these are all, to me, reasons to kind of, make spotted sea trout a good candidate to assess the stock, see if these environment recruitment relationships exist, but mainly just give the stock or the state some management advice on where the stock is. And to do this, we'll use a statistical catch-at-age model. One of the main platforms that's used across the world is called stock synthesis. It's what's used to give catch advice on many of the federally and state managed fish stocks. And this approach will involve incorporating all available catch, biological compositions, and abundance indices, as well as update the life history for the stock. And after doing all this, I would like to consider different methods of determining those reference points that I talked about. So that would include stock recruit relationship, as well as trying to include some of those environmental covariates in there. And with that, we move to an offshore reef fish here. So in chapter 2, I'll talk about some of the life history on this very cool fish, in my opinion, scamp grouper. So scamp distributed across the Southeast. It supports commercial and recreational fisheries across its range. It's federally managed. Moderate longevity, so they'll live up to over 20, 30 years. They are winter spawners and form spawning aggregations. But something very important and interesting about scamp is that they're protogynous hermaphrodite, meaning that all the fish are born female, reach sexual maturity, and then essentially transition into males, which from a fisheries management standpoint can be something not traditional, something very different approaches needed to manage these species. So like I said, the life history and the ecology present a very interesting challenge to fisheries management. Traditionally, with the gonochoristic or the two-sex fish stocks, like most fish stocks, managers are worried about maintaining enough spawning biomass, but specifically female spawning biomass. And one of the main approaches to do that is to maintain older fish or larger fish, because they tend to produce more than the younger fish or the smaller fish. But we can't just do that for the hermaphrodites. These fish, like I mentioned, they start off as females, reach sexual maturity, and they'll be eventually they will transition into being males. So we can't just keep those older age classes and think that we're okay. We need to account for those mid-sized fish, because they are the most fecund females. And you can see that here on the upper right panel. So the top one is gag grouper and the one below is scamp. And really what I'm trying to show you here is just the egg production and how it changes with age. So from age 2, we're not producing that many eggs, but as we move to those mid ages, like around 4, 6, that's when we peak with total egg production. But then as we get older, egg production essentially becomes non-existent, because these fish are not producing eggs anymore. They're putting all their energy into transitioning into males. So we need to account for these mid-size age classes when we're managing these fish stocks, as well as the older age classes. So naturally, this is a female skewed population. A lot of females, not that many males. And when we put fishing pressure or place fishing pressure on these stocks, we can run into issues like bottlenecking male recruitment, which can lead to sperm limitation, which is, like I mentioned, traditionally not what we're worried about. Sperm is cheap, is what they say. But with these fish stocks, you really have to think about, the male biomass. And I present here the famous gag grouper, which is perhaps the poster child of this strategy. Very important fish stock in the Southeast, protogynous hermaphrodites. And, this stock has been severely depleted across decades. And it's estimated that currently the male sex ratio is somewhere around 5%, if not below. So it's very, very important issue in terms of sustainability here. So, it's, and like I mentioned earlier with the reef fishes, this is one of those reef fishes that's mixed in with a lot of other fish stocks, like say red snapper, that are perhaps not as, vulnerable to fishing. So that's something to consider when you're managing these reef fisheries that have all these different life history strategies within it. And the current scamp stock status, perhaps not the most worrying out of all the other fish stocks, but I personally believe that, fishing pressure has increased over time as many of these other fish stocks have been subject to more regulation. So think about red snapper, great triggerfish, greater amberjack. And then also add to that fishing power has increased over time. There are bigger, better vessels, better technology that allows fishers to go way further offshore where these fish are mainly located. So again, I'm showing you here a Kobe plot on the upper right, where it doesn't seem that concerning for the most part. The fish stock is under that fishing mortality reference point. It's above the biomass or the spawning biomass reference point, but we can see that in those last few dots where you see the 2020, we're bordering on that biomass level. So as of now, not a big issue, but it may be something that we need to think about over time, especially because in other regions like the South Atlantic, the population has really been depleted dramatically. And I'm showing you that in the bottom left there. This is an abundance index from a paired camera trap survey. And this is showing you the count or the catch of scamp in this survey. And you can see that, starting from the 90s, seems to be okay, but then those last, say, decade or so, the stock has been severely depleted. And this specific diagram is for the population itself, not just the recruitment, but within this paper published by Dr. Batchelor, one of the main hypotheses is that recruitment failure is being observed in this stock. And then in the bottom right there, this is the recruitment from the stock assessment for the Gulf, the most recent one. And you can see that in the last, again, like 10-ish years, that recruitment that's shown in the red line is it's somewhat below the long-term average. So something is happening with recruitment for this stock. As for previous camp life history studies, so most of the stuff has happened for the Gulf has happened in the West Florida shelf, and that's not a surprise. That's where most of the stock and the fishery is distributed. But this stock is all the way around the Gulf, all the way to the Campeche Bank, and even it's caught even in Louisiana and Texas. So I personally am trying to focus on a segment of the distribution that hasn't been studied as well, and I'm denoting that in the green box there. And then for the South Atlantic, there's a couple of studies as well, a little more dated, but like I said, the segment that I'm showing there in the green box, not as well described. And I will note that one of the two studies in the West Florida shelf, the Lombardi-Carlson study, does have samples that go all the way to Texas, but they're very small sample sizes. So I'm really trying to get into this, segment that we don't know much about. Having said that, the goals of this chapter are to develop growth models for the scam population and that segment that I showed you, estimate longevity-based natural mortality for the stock and that distribution, and then estimate size and age at 50% maturity and transition to male, as well as investigate some of the reproductive ecology of the stock. So things like sex ratios, fecundity, things of that nature. To do those first two objectives, we have been collecting sagittal otoliths or ear stones, which you can see there on the left panel. Eventually, we collect those and we process those, and you end up with slides that look like the one on the right there. And that is our main approach to get age estimates of the fish. With those age estimates, once we have those, we can get a grasp of how old these fish get, and using those ages, we can get into things like natural mortality based on longevity. So once we have sampled all our fish and age all our fish, we'll have an idea of how old they get in this segment of the population, and we can get into things like the natural mortality, that being the mortality not coming from fishing pressure. And then for the latter two objectives, collecting gonads will allow us to conduct histology on these fish and get a sense of at what lengths, ages these fish are mature, when do they reach sexual maturity, when do they transition into being males. And like I mentioned with the protogynous hermaphrodites, they're so complicated that you need to rely on histology to get into these questions, because starting as females and transitioning to males, they'll retain some of those female elements in the gonads, and it may look like a female on the outside macroscopically, but when you place or put the samples in histology, you'll see that there may be a combination of tissues, there may be male cells within the gonad. So another reason why the hermaphrodites can be very complicated. And lastly, for this same fish stock, I would like to describe some of the habitat use and the size structure across not just the center of the Gulf, but really all the northern part of the Gulf. And to describe a little bit of the habitat preference for scamp, like most reef fishes, not a surprise. They like structure, mainly low relief, hard bottom. And as is the case in our region here, they will associate with artificial reefs when there is a lack or absence of natural hard bottom. And, we can see that here in Alabama, where we have a very complex reef or artificial reef system distributed across our shelf. And we routinely see these fish using those habitats. However, we don't really have a good grasp on what specific artificial reef habitats they prefer. And we don't really know much about ontogenetic shifts and their habitat use. So to get into those questions, one of the main things that I want to look at is what environmental variables influence scamp presence and abundance across this distribution, as well as investigate what drives the patterns in size structure across the Northern Gulf. And I'd like to quickly introduce you to these fishery independent video surveys. Very, very useful approach to monitor marine biodiversity. So not just fish, beyond fish. And you can get into things like recording species presence, abundance. Opportunistically, you can record length measurements if you have lasers mounted on your video survey. And then you can also get into some of the habitat characteristics and environmental variables. And in our region, these surveys provide provide abundance indices for a lot of our fish stocks. So a lot of our fish stocks, are using or have abundance indices that come from these video surveys. So very useful approach. It's somewhat non-invasive compared to other approaches, and it's being adopted across the world in many countries to monitor, like I said, not just fishes, but also just marine biodiversity in period. So to get into these questions, I will use 3 different fishery independent video surveys. So first we have the CMAP Reef Fish Video Survey, specifically the western portion of the survey. And you can see that in that farther left box. And this survey spans all the way back to 1992 and mainly targets deeper shelf, so outer shelf habitats. And then we have the Panama City survey, which also covers that deeper shelf, but it also has a lot of the mid shelf region. So that will be a good contrast with that other divot or that other half of the excuse me, of the distribution up here in the Northern Gulf. But then we also have the Powers Lab remotely operated vehicle survey, where we're mainly sampling over a lot of artificial habitats. So we have some contrast here. A lot of change, a lot of different approaches to these surveys. They cover different habitats, different time ranges. So collectively, I want to use all these to get into those questions of, what's driving their abundance across or presence and abundance across this region, as well as changes in habitat use across length and age. And you can kind of see that here where I'm showing you laser measurements from those 3 surveys. So in the green, you have the Panama City survey, which I mentioned covers a lot of that continental shelf. And you can kind of see that on the size distribution there. It's got more younger fish than, say, the CMAP West survey there in purple. But that purple survey there in the Western Gulf is also covering, like I said, that deeper habitat. It includes important areas like the flower garden banks, which perhaps may be an important area for this fish stock, and that might be reflected in these larger fish that we're seeing there on that graph. And then we have the Powers Lab ROV survey, which you kind of can't see there too well, but it's in the bottom. Shorter time range, not as abundant in terms of fish as the other surveys. So that's why some of the main reasons why you're seeing lower sample sizes there. But to identify what variables influence the scamp presence and abundance for each of these surveys, I would like to use generalized additive models, which try to account for nonlinearities in these predictor variables. And then I would also like to investigate patterns in the size structure of scamp in all these different surveys. So having collected, those length measurements and some of that habitat description, I would like to tease apart like which of these habitat variables or environmental variables are influencing, habitat use of scamp across age or length mainly here, since we're collecting lengths. And having said all that, let me try to put this all together for you. So why is this relevant? So first and foremost, we're providing updated management advice specifically for spotted sea trout. Like I mentioned, the stock hasn't been assessed in over 5 years, and a lot of things have happened ever since, including management changes. So it will be very useful for the state to get an idea of where the stock is at now. And of course, also, this contributes to ongoing efforts to evolve stock assessments and fisheries management, and specifically in that spotted sea trout assessment and the questions that I would like to investigate within the assessment. They're kind of main research areas in stock assessment science currently, so it feeds into that as well. And then the environment recruitment relationships that I'm trying to investigate for spotted sea trout can be transferred to many other fish stocks across our region that we hypothesize may be driven more by environmental variables rather than spawning stock biomass, for example. And then we're improving the knowledge on life history and habitat for scamp. And as I showed you earlier, perhaps the stock is doing okay right now, but it seems that it might be going in the direction we don't want it to go. So to me, that makes it, that information is very important as we move along and try to reassess the stock in a couple of years. And all of this holistically is contributing to ecosystem-based management. Like I mentioned, traditionally, we're assessing these stocks just using information related to the stock, not necessarily habitat or environmental variables. So by trying to include those and have more holistic management, we're feeding into that ecosystem-based management. And all this with the main goal of supporting climate resilient fisheries management. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time.